Alright, welcome to Flip the Classroom number 2. Tonight we're looking at how U.S. involvement in World War I changed the war. If you remember from yesterday's lecture or last night's Flip the Classroom video, we talked about how at first we had a neutrality stance in the United States. You got a lot of Americans who are very isolationist, wanting to think back to George Washington's farewell address, saying, "Don't get involved, it's 3,000 miles away, it's not our business." Well, then things like the sinking Lusitania, and then the unrestricted submarine warfare from the Germans, and the Zimmermann Note, those all kind of combined to make it so that the United States felt like we need to get involved on the side of the Allies. So if you look at the objective here, identify political and military turn points of the war, well, obviously the American war machine coming into the war is going to be a huge difference maker for the Allies. But when America mobilized for war, and remember when we talked about yesterday's lecture, like you talk about days of mobilization, like M1 would be the second day you're mobilizing for. M1 would be the first day. M2 would be the second day. All right, but you look there, the Selective Service Act, something that established a draft. This was something that had been going on all the way back in the Civil War. Remember we talked about both sides drafting soldiers in the Civil War. But I've got the required men to register with the government in order to be randomly selected for military service, and that's still something that guys have to do when they're 18 years old today. Every guy that's watching this video, when he turns 18, has to register with the selective service system. Nowadays, most of the time it's done online. You can pick up the little flyers at the post office, and that puts your name in the lottery for the draft. It doesn't mean you're going to get drafted. We haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War. But if you look down there in the third bullet point, by 1918 we had 3 million called up out of 24 million who were registered for the draft. And then yesterday we looked at propaganda posters. This is when all of those were put into use. And remember this guy right here, who you can't really read his signature, James Montgomery Flagg. He drew a lot of these posters. And again, it was part of the Committee on Public Information. But a lot of different kinds of people served. At this time, the military was still segregated. African Americans were serving as segregated units, and usually commanded by white officers. And women did serve in some branches of the military. I've got there. They were given rank in the Navy and Marines, but not in the Army. Obviously, women were not in combat roles. They were serving as nurses, communications personnel, things of that nature. But the first thing we had to figure out how to do when we started to mobilize for war was how are you going to get all the men, food, and equipment we needed across the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, especially when you've got German submarines, or what they call wolf packs, not the crappy school in Raleigh, but the groups of submarines preying on merchant vessels. And a lot of people that were considered very important to this effort, like shipyard workers, were given what was called draft exempt status or deferred status, so they would not be drafted right away. We eventually figured out how to fight that Wolfpack system that Germans were using to sink Allied shipping with the convoy system. You had merchant ships escorted by heavy destroyers, and eventually Allied shipping losses, they still happened, but they were cut in half. You see here a convoy. You'd have a big group of merchant vessels spread over several miles, accompanied by several naval destroyers. But when the Americans come into the war, they bring out a lot of enthusiasm. You think about the soldiers in Europe were fighting in a trench war, and we looked at trenches yesterday, and it's pretty miserable. Talked about how people got shell-shocked from not even being able to get rest at night, being bombarded all night long. So the Americans are now ready to fight, and it's given a renewed kind of boost of energy and renewed sense of purpose to the Allied side. And the leader of the American Expeditionary Force is the same guy that we talked about chasing Pancho Villa around the Mexican border. Is John Blackjack Pershing, and he gets that Blackjack nickname because he was originally commander of mostly African American troops. And the American group in Europe is called the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF. And these AEF troops are nicknamed Doughboys, and I've read several reasons for this. I've got there because they had shiny white belts. Also, they were fresh troops, like fresh dough coming out of the or that you're about to bake. But I've got there most of these were small town boys that hadn't really been far from home. Imagine somebody growing up in Bethel, North Carolina in the 19-teens, way away, kind of disconnected from the rest of the world. All of a sudden they're thrown into these big cities like Paris and London, big training centers, and this was a new experience for a lot of guys. And it's kind of tough to see in this painting, but you can see these guys are wearing helmets that almost look like full-brimmed hats, kind of like farmers' hats or a little bit like cowboy hats. That was a kind of trademark of the American Expeditionary Force in Europe. But when the Americans came into the war, they brought a lot of new weapons with them. Some of these obviously were already in use by the Europeans. But the first one's the machine gun. This wasn't the first war for the machine gun, but it was the first war the machine gun made a significant impact. And if you look at that picture, you've got 3 guys operating one machine gun. These weren't, M16s that people can run around with. These were big stationary machine guns that you could move from place to place, but it would be a process. And you would have to have several people feeding bullets into the machine gun. The machine guns had been used in the Spanish-American War in very, very, very rudimentary versions before the Spanish-American War, but like I said, World War I is the first time they make a big impact. And this is also the first time planes make a big impact in war. Believe it or not, the first planes used in war were pilots flying by each other in open cockpit planes like this, holding pistols out the side of the cockpit, shooting at each other. Eventually, the Germans kind of took the lead and took the initiative in developing planes for fighting. And, Germans actually, they kind of had superior aeronautical technology all the way up through World War II for the most part. If any of y'all know the BMW sign, that BMW sign is actually supposed to be a propeller against the field of blue, against the blue sky. They originally started as an airplane engine company. This is a picture of Eddie Rickenbacker, and he was the first American to fight in Gase. And then also, the Germans were the first ones to figure out ways to time the fire mechanism from the plane with the engine and the propeller so that you don't shoot your own propeller when you're shooting out the front of the plane. Another new weapon was the Zeppelin. Zeppelins were kind of like big blimps, and these Zeppelins could float over the enemy, they could drop bombs, they can scout enemy positions. And if you've ever heard of the Hindenburg was something that was a big disaster in the 1930s that was from a Zeppelin. It's probably the best or most well-known Zeppelin incident. Right here you see mustard gas. Mustard gas was used heavily during the war. This is kind of difficult to see what's going on here. These are actually little people, all those little dots right there. And this is not the first time the world's seen biological warfare. Biological warfare goes hundreds of years back. Goes back to the Middle Ages, but even during the colonial period, the British would sometimes rub blankets over smallpox victims and give those to Native Americans as gifts. So that could be biological warfare. But these gas attacks were things that would pretty much cripple you. You see here troops with gas masks on in training camps. The troops had to learn to put these masks on in a hurry. And they eventually figured out that gas would lie low. And if you laid in the low area with the gas out, the gas mask on, you died probably a slow and painful death. I've got there that mustard gas was the most commonly used one. There were some others, but this was also kind of psychological warfare because it kept the soldiers kind of on edge and freaked out. And in this image, you see a soldier that's been exposed to some mustard gas. I've stuck this map in here on the slide to show you again who the Allied Central Powers were. And remember, Germany right here, they're faced with having to fight a two-front war where they've got Russia on this side and France on this side. And that was why originally they had the Schleifen plan, where they were going to attack through Belgium into Paris and knock out the French before the Russians could mobilize, which didn't quite work. But remember, that's also what drew Britain into the war when the Germans invaded Belgium. We're going to talk a little more later on, and hopefully some of the groups that are researching battles in World War I will tell you a little bit more about some of these battles on the different fronts during World War I. But a little side note right here while I'm thinking about it, I see all these arrows going into the Eastern Front in Russia. Russia had a pretty crappily prepared military at the start of the war, and that was going to be a big hindrance to the Allied side. And they had officers who were officers because of family names rather than because of merit, which obviously didn't mean they were fit to serve. And this image of a trench, I put this in here so you kind of get the idea that these trenches were temporary homes, but they were really homes for a while because people did, or the troops did do things like make them fortified, and it wasn't always something that you would fight from for a day and then move on. Sometimes they would be bogged down for months and years in the same trench. And I've had people ask me in the past, are these dead bodies or are they sleeping bodies? And to that, I don't know the answer, I'll be honest. But I'm jumping way ahead here to the end of the war. But I do want you to understand that World War I did not end with a surrender by Germany. In November of 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Allied forces, but the German soldiers mutinied. They still didn't surrender, and Germany was finally kind of coerced into a ceasefire on the 11th day, the 11th month, the 11th hour, November 11th, 1918, and that's where we're going to see World War II picks up, really because Hitler's able to come to power, because many Germans don't feel like they surrendered. They just signed this ceasefire or armistice. So this is going to be a very important term to remember.